Hello, everybody, and welcome to one of our first podcast episodes here on for the convention that is going to happen in Hermosillo next year in August. The official title is the 29th National Convention of Ferro Modelistas, Rail Modelers, and Ferro Aficionados, Rail Aficionados de la República Mexicana, the Mexican Republic. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for us to share railroad history in the state of Sonora. And with us today, we have a guest speaker, and I'm grateful for him to being here. This is Dr. Marco Macias he was a associate professor from the Fort Hays University in Kansas. And today, we are going to be talking about the impact of the railroads in Sonora during the Mexican Revolution. Dr. Macias is a expert on Pancho Villa and the Mexican Revolution. So we have a couple of questions here, and we'll review them over, and it's going to be in a little bit of a relaxed environment. And hopefully, Marco can spread some information about what the impact of what the roads were in Sonora. But first, I think it's important. Let's talk about the origin of the railroads in Mexico in general. So we're looking at this, and there was obviously railroad projects prior to Porfirio Diaz, but they were small, and some of them were still in conversations. But it was really Porfirio Diaz who started the modernization of the infrastructure of the railroads, correct?
Yes. First, thank you for having me here, Jonathan. Today, it's a pleasure being able to talk to you today. But yes, moving into the 19th century and the railroads, there are efforts prior to the Porfiriato to create the infrastructure of what are the first lines in Mexico, right? And I think the first line, I don't know, the first line is kind of a line that runs from Mexico City, smaller, of course, back then to the Villa Guadalupe, and then the official like first line was connecting Mexico City to Veracruz. Being Veracruz one of the major port cities, or if not the most important port city, with commercial ties to Mexico City, and then of course doing a Porfiriato, with a more a peace peacified, whatever you want to call it, a country under peace, order and progress, as the Porfiristas would say. You have the availability to get foreign investors in some of these railroad projects, which, I mean, they are, for the infrastructure, right, that they bring to the country, are wonderful advancements in essentially technological revolution, and bringing Mexico to the 20th century. It really is. It's. I mean, I'll stop for now, but it really is a significant phenomenon. The development of railroads in Mexico and its ability to it goes hand in hand with the Porfiriato.
Yes, absolutely. And I think to kind of allow our American audience to kind of understand, it's like the same how railroads transformed the United States, how it connected the West with the East, and it transformed multiple states and created cities throughout. And so that is the same instance in Mexico. The differences in a lot of ways is that Mexico received a lot of this funding from both American and European investment, and it was building lines north to south versus the United States, it was east to west. So it's kind of interesting how that gets transformed because some of the first lines from Mexico are really focused on exportation, taking resources out of Mexico to the United States. So the two major lines are the ones that go into Texas. I believe it was there's a couple of few that are in Texas. I think it might have been the one that connects to Piedras Negras right now in Eagle Pass, and then the other
Mhm.
one is El Paso over there. So those are like the first two original major lines that pushed for the railroads, and they were backed by American businesses and companies, and which brings us over into Sonora, since this is the main topic that we're talking about. The first railroad in Sonora was actually a railroad that was founded or funded by the Addison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railway, which
Mhm.
is famous or one of the most well-known railroads in the United States, iconic for like the Super Chief, passenger service, and Super C's fast train, fast service. So But the thing is that the Santa Fe did not hold on it for too long. But so in 1879 was when the first railroad in Sonora came in, and it was a railroad from Nogales down to Guaymas to the seaport there to once again try to send exportation out of there. But as we transformed into it later on, the Southern Pacific gets interested in Mexico. And at the same time, later towards around the 1900s, you have two other businessmen that are trying to get in there. You have Philip Dodge Corporation and also with the Montezuma Copper, um, what is it, consolidation or something like that?
Kind
Um,
of not copper company.
Copper Company. So the Montezuma Copper Company is the line that builds from Narco Sonora down to Cananea, and then for Philip Dodge, who was founded the El Paso and Southwestern, they have another railroad that's the Ferrocarril de Nacasari, which is from Agua Prieta down to Nacasari. So various types of railroads and Americans are coming in, and Porfirio Diaz is enjoying this because he's seeing how it's transforming Sonora. And so eventually, the Santa Fe Railroad leases the Sonoran Railway. That's what the railroad was called. And they lease that over to the Southern Pacific in exchange for the line from Needles, California to Barstow. And so this was significant because this is how Santa Fe was able to get to Los Angeles on its own tracks. In the past, they were using Southern Pacific. They were at the mercy of using Southern Pacific because originally Southern Pacific was really a rival to Santa Fe, and they didn't want Santa Fe in there at all. So this was a big leverage for Santa Fe. So eventually, in the 1900s, Santa Fe completely sells it to Southern Pacific, and Southern Pacific creates the Sud-Pacifico de Mexico, the Southern Pacific of Mexico. And they continue to extend the line with the intention of expanding the line all the way down to Guadalajara, possibly even to Mexico City. But something happens, and that is the Mexican Revolution, which stops the progress of this. And for those who do not know, Sonora has a big impact in this because they say that the first event that started the Mexican Revolution was in Cananea. And Marco, could you take it over from here?
So yeah, yes. So I do want to add to this railroad discussion. And you were mentioning, Jonathan, about the expansion in Mexico about north south, and it's a very similar context of expanding the west, right? And how the railroad really allows for the government to, I don't want to say pacify, but I guess the word is pacify indigenous groups throughout the Southwest, right? Why? Because they have easy access to mobility, right? So they're able to mobilize troops much quicker, which are able then to offset like native resistance in the area. And you see a very similar pattern in what is Chihuahua and Sonora with the introduction of railroads, especially in Chihuahua, right? Indigenous groups kind of lose that edge that they've historically had. And that's what made the Porfiriato also very successful. The railroads made the Porfiriato not only economically successful, but they also allowed it to control Mexico much more effectively. So now I yes, the Cananea strike. So what happens is that um and there's growing dissatisfaction with the amount of foreign investors, but also very importantly, the amount of foreigners occupying like mid-level jobs in Mexico. So what would happen was that these foreign companies would go into Cananea, a rich copper region, and they would hire U.S. citizens for middle upper management. And so what you end up having over time is a disenfranchisement of Mexicans saying, we can do those jobs, um, but they're not getting paid, right? They're not getting paid those foreign salaries, and so they kind of essentially they go on a strike in 1906, and so that is really a testament to the beginning of the revolution and how Sonora spearheads that involvement, not only because it has some elements that will later be part of the revolution, but because it kind of really showcases the like what side the Porfiriato is on, right? And it's really on the side of foreign investors. It's very notable. The owner of the company, right, William Cornell Greene, an American, right, that sets shop in Cananea, uh, calls on the U.S. To help him, and Mexico allows rangers to cross the line in order to stop the strike. So it's also very kind of public, if you will, how this strike is put down by foreigners with the blessing of the Porfiriato. And it's not that the Porfiriato didn't have elements in Sonora. Like they had pretty good control over Sonora. It just Emilio Korseliski, one of the colonels, even though he was Russian born, he was the Mexican official in charge of the area, couldn't get there in time to quell the strike. So again, this strike and the Rio Blanco strike in the state of Veracruz are pivotal moments, instances of essentially what will be the revolution. That disenfranchisement, or the Porfiriato showing cracks in the system, that it's no longer able to sustain itself.
Absolutely. So we can see that not only was the Canea strike was a moment of Sonora suffering from the Porfirio Ato, we also see that during the same time, an undergroup in Sonora were also suffering. This was also the Yaquis. And it's interesting because the Yaquis were also used as laborers for the railroads as well. And so during that time, the Yaquis had this long um, history of resistance against colonialization. They never really got along well with the Porfirio Diaz administration. And so the Yaquis had various rebellions. And so Porfirio Diaz actually started to deport Yaquis from their homeland. And there's a story about how, well, there's not stories, there's actual, the Yaquis actually got to get deported from Sonora all the way down to Oaxaca and into the Yucatan. And so it's ironic because a lot of the how they get shipped down there, it's ironic because they take this path of how the future railroads are going to be down there. And so seeing how a lot of these Yaquis were transferred or they used the railroads to escape to get to Arizona to avoid the same deportation. And so we can see that there's different events that are happening right now that are unfolding that is going to become the Mexican Revolution. And so we see that in eventually, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Porfirio Diaz does get outvoted by the upcoming president, Francisco Madero. See, so he takes over, and then this is when Porfirio Diaz flees Mexico, right? And then he still has his resistance there, correct?
So what happens is he in 1908 he gives an interview to a U.S. journalist or a foreign journalist, he saying that he doesn't want to run for president in 2010, and so that he kind of opens up the political spectrum to opposition. So Francisco Madero kind of says, well, I want to be, I want to be president, and he runs a campaign against the political apparatus, and Diaz convinces himself that, what, that was kind of a fluke. Like he does want to run again, and so he has Madero imprisoned, and that's when Madero realizes that the elections are kind of sham, and that the only way is really to have a revolution. So he escapes, actually disguised as a ferrocarrilero, and escapes towards San Antonio, Texas, and then that's kind of where he starts this cry for the revolution, that starts in November of 2010,
And
after the centennial celebrations and all that stuff.
then we forgot to mention, or that if people haven't been following along, Porfirio Diaz at this point has been in charge of Mexico since 1876, right? And then he had other moments where he had intern people that were president, but they were under his control. They were like his associates. But Porfirio Diaz has been controlling Mexico for decades in Mexico. So finally, the people of Mexico get upset and they finally start this revolution. And so now, railroads being the new technology, they play a role in this. And so this comes up into one of our questions here. How would you see how the railroads played a role in the revolution, and how did the different military fractions like Pancho Villa utilize the railroads?
So it is interesting, and I think very ironic that railroads play such an important part in the perfect. In They play a very important part in Porfiriato. Like they make the Porfiriato economically, but then it's also kind of the downfall of the Porfiriato in how the revolutionaries use it to essentially mobilize troops, right? So Sonora has that the vantage point that it really has it's really untouched in terms of its natural resources that it can offer the revolutionaries. It's theoretically because it's so isolated, but it has access to railroads, so you have movement, but it's like being in the center. It's really hard to get to Sonora, so that's really the vantage point. Chihuahua has a little bit less of that. It has a railroad that connects to El Paso all the way down to Mexico City. But what happens is a lot of ferrocarrileros are revolutionaries, and so they're the technical. They're the people that actually know how to run the trains. So right once the revolution starts, they're like, I know how to operate the train. Like I'll help you all. And so when you take a look at Villa, like Villa's right hand man was a ferrocarrilero. Like his background was in railroads. That's what he had done in for as a living, right? Rodolfo Fierro was from Sonora, I believe, but ended up in Chihuahua. But like that, his profession was a ferrocarrilero, and Villa like understood. The other thing is, the revolutionaries understood the value of the ferrocarril for the movement of troops and surprise attacks. So Villa is notorious for doing this in November of 1913, launching a Trojan style attack on Ciudad Juarez, where he essentially captures a train, loads it up with troops, and then sends it back to Ciudad Juarez. And then once it gets to Ciudad Juarez, it's like it's full of revolutionaries, and they take over the city in a second.
Yes, and then I believe also the first battle of Agua Prieta, that was the first time that railroads were being used during the revolution, correct? And that was like one of the first big battles of the revolution, correct? And so in that sense, then that was a railroad that was coming in from the United States into Agua Prieta, because that was not connected to any on the railroad in Mexico at that time. But railroads, we can see that that played a part in that battle then.
They are important, and also because um, when it is interesting because the U.S. does play favorites with some revolutionary factions, and what happens with that is they will allow the movement of Mexican troops to cross into the United States and use their railroad services to like go to other parts of northern Mexico.
Ah,
So when, for example, Villa attacks Agua Prieta, which is being defended by Plutarco Elias Calles, he's allowed reinforcements by this is 1915. Of course, we were getting way ahead of ourselves, but he's essentially allowed reinforcements from Eagle Pass to cross into the United States, cross all the way from Texas to New Mexico, Arizona, and reinforce Calles' position. And that really plays an important part in Calles sustaining his position in Agua Prieta. So
very interesting.
railroads play a really important part, even like diplomatically, in the revolution.
Yeah.
And going to Villa, Villa had he had a special train, right? So the train consisted of a field hospital that was on the train itself, which so it was mobile. So it's one of the most up to date train, hospitals known to anybody really. Like we're talking about comparisons to World War I. Like the VIA is on the cutting edge of railroad technology, I guess in that sense also with the Brigada Sanitaria. Um, and then also it's kind of, I think, funny, but he had an entourage of newspaper reporters, which he put in a film crew that put in a special cart that had their branding on the side, which is Mutual Film Corporation.
Yes, I was just about to mention that to you about how Pancho Villa did use or hire, I believe it was Hollywood producers, right, to film him during the Mexican Revolution. And it was interesting because there's a museum in Puebla, Mexico, uh, the National Train Museum there, that they do have a boxcar that recognizes that. And I remember when I sent it to you, but then I mentioned to you that this can't be an official because it was actually a steel boxcar. But back then in the 1900s, the boxcars were made out of wood. So the museum got a little creative, but I thought that was interesting how they were honoring Pancho Villa's legacy, or how he utilizes the railroads for that.
Yeah, they are. I've only seen one image of the Brigada Sanitaria. I've seen other, but I have seen other images of similar kind of railroad hospitals used by other factions. So I mean, Via is at the cutting edge, but also it really does talk about like the implementation by other factions of the same technology. Um, and I
Yeah.
don't what I don't know is if the federal forces, the federados, had a similar like system.
Yeah, and then also speaking on that, um Pancho Villa, he was originally part of Carranza's forces, right? The Constitutionalists, and then he separated himself. So could you
Yes.
tell him about that? Because the Constitutionalists later also had their own trains, correct?
Yes. So what happens is Francisco Madero is assassinated by counter-revolutionary forces. The what's the reminiscences of the Porfiriato, right? In 1913, and so this leads to a revolutionaries, rising up against Victoriano Huerta. Villa is part of that push in Chihuahua after the assassination of his recruiter, Abraham Gonzalez. So this is also speaking why the importance of Sonora to the revolution. So Chihuahua was out of the question because of the assassination of Abraham Gonzalez. Coahuila is it has readable access to Carranza, the governor, has to flee to Sonora because it really is the last bastion of hope for the revolutionaries. And Sonora, it's a little bit complicated, but Jose Maria Maitorena is the one in charge of the state at the time. He asks for a leave of absence. He ends up in Tucson for a bit. But really, it's the Sonorenses that take charge and control under Carranza of that of like fighting the revolution, that this next phase of the revolution. So they're all like on the same page until Huerta is ousted from power in 1914.
Excellent. Yeah, and then so you already mentioned this is why Carranza flees to Sonora, even though I believe he wasn't from Sonora, right? He was from
No, Cuatro Ciénegas, Coahuila.
Yeah. And so he ended up going there. And it's interesting, one of the little interesting tidbits that we can see history from this is that during his time in Sonora, he makes a trip to Magdalena de Quino, which is a city north of Hermosillo, almost towards the border of Arizona. And the station that he visits is still up to date in that small town to this day. And it's still one of the few Southern Pacific stations that actually are still around. It's badly in repair of some preservation, so hopefully it will get back to restoration in that form. But when the Mexican government took over the railroad, the Southern Pacific of Mexico, they really modernized a lot of the whole infrastructure. But that station was one that actually stood time, and they decided to keep it. So that's interesting, and it's one of those little interesting moments of time that we can reflect and actually visit the station to this day. But yeah, and then that's why it's so when what you just mentioned right now, is this why also Hermosillo is known as the revolutionary capital of the country because it was like that last hope?
I think so. I mean, without Sonora and Hermosillo specifically, there isn't really a space where the revolutionaries could gather and kind of organize. We have to understand that. I mean, we could say, well, what about Cuautla? What about Morelos with the Zapatistas? But we have to understand that the La Frontera, right, is very important because the Woodrow Wilson administration is very favorable in supporting the revolutionaries against Huerta. So having access to the border and being able to move things into the border like guns and ammunition and just like goods in general, is key to preserving the livelihood of the revolutionaries, right? It just, if access to the north wouldn't have been an option, it would have, we don't know, things could have been different.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see that despite Sonora being one of those states that is away from Mexico's history of it being centralized, where everything seems to be from Mexico City or Guadalajara or maybe Monterrey, we see that the impact that Sonora has on the country of Mexico. And we see that this influence of Sonora happens because after the Mexican Revolution in 1920, we see that there's the four men who become president of Mexico that are all from Sonora, right? So we can see that definitely there's this impact. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think all of them except for Rodriguez were from revolutionary leaders, correct?
Yeah, for the most, yeah, you're right. Adolfo de la Huerta was a revolutionary leader. Obregón, of course, was the revolutionary leader. I think, really, and I mean, he was the I guess I want to say the army, arm of the revolution, of the Carranza faction, and then of course Plutarco Elias Calles has his own reputation. And then, yeah, Álvaro Obregón, Abelardo L. Rodriguez is important, I think, in that kind of transition from, he's a military man himself, but kind of this like transition more or less to like military to civilian, which doesn't really happen till later, but he is, I don't want, maybe more like a he is part of that newer generation of revolutionaries, but not in the same way of as Plutarco Elias Calles. He has more practical political, like, because he was governor of the Territorio de Baja California Norte, so he has much more political experience than I, than his predecessors. Even though Calles is honestly pretty astute politically.
Very, very good. So, thank you for this. I think that's all the questions we have left on here. But for anybody questioning, if they ever want to see this influence, if they manage to come down to Guaymas, Sonora, there is actually a plaza in the downtown area where they honor those four presidents of Mexico, four individual statues. So we can see that the legacy of Sonora, of the revolution, is in Sonora, and without Sonora, Mexico would be a very different country. So I want to thank again Dr. Macias for joining us today, and hopefully we can see that there's this huge impact of the how railroads transformed the country of Mexico and how Sonora played a part in it. And we hope that many of you will join us for the upcoming convention that is going to happen in Hermosillo in August of next year. And hopefully Dr. Macias can join us as well. And we look forward to continue having various conversations like this, both about how history is and the impact of the railroads, but also talk about the fun stuff about trains in general, like talking about the locomotives, about how they work, and even checking out various models that we're going to have. But there's be a lot of opportunities. But please to keep yourself updated. Please continue to follow us here on Facebook, and also look forward to our upcoming for our website that we have up and running. The link or the HTML link will be added to this video at below. But anyway, thank you, Dr. Macias, for joining us here, and we look forward to hearing from you and joining us in the future.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Thank you.